There comes a point in life where everything that once felt stable begins to feel uncertain. Plans that were carefully built begin to fall apart without warning. Expectations that once felt guaranteed suddenly feel unreachable. Doors that were expected to open remain closed no matter how much effort is applied. And in the middle of all of this, a quiet but heavy confusion begins to settle in. It is not always loud at first. It begins subtly through small disappointments, through delayed answers, through moments where things simply do not go as expected. But over time, these moments begin to accumulate, and what once felt like a temporary delay starts to feel like a pattern that cannot be easily understood. In this state, even clarity begins to fade. Questions begin to rise that do not have immediate answers. Why is this happening? Why is progress not visible? Why does effort not seem to produce results? These questions do not always come with urgency, but they linger in the background of every thought, quietly shaping perception and emotion. And as time passes, something deeper begins to form, not just confusion, but emotional exhaustion. A feeling that no matter how much is done, nothing is shifting. A sense that movement exists, but direction does not feel clear anymore. This is where trust is tested in its most difficult form. Not when everything is going smoothly, not when answers are visible and outcomes are predictable, but when nothing seems to make sense at all. When effort continues but results remain hidden. When silence feels louder than progress. When waiting becomes longer than expected and understanding feels just out of reach. In this space, control becomes the natural desire. The mind tries to take over, to figure things out, to force clarity where none exists. Yet, it begins to search for explanations, patterns, reasons, anything that can make sense of what is happening. But the more control is demanded, the heavier the internal pressure becomes, because not everything can be immediately understood while it is still unfolding. And this is where the deeper struggle begins. It is not just about circumstances anymore. It becomes internal, a battle between what is seen and what is believed, between what is felt and what is hoped for, between the visible present and the unseen future. And in that tension, patience is stretched beyond comfort. Yet even in this stretching, something important is happening, because moments like these reveal something deeper than success ever could. They reveal what remains when certainty is removed. They expose what is truly rooted when external confirmation disappears, and they show whether trust is dependent on outcomes or anchored in something stronger than outcomes. In the absence of clarity, the instinct is often to step away, to withdraw belief, to assume that delay means denial. But that assumption is often shaped by emotion rather than understanding, because silence is not always absence. Delay is not always absence. Delay is not always rejection. And confusion is not always failure. Still, in the moment, these truths are difficult to hold on to, because human understanding naturally seeks immediate answers. It prefers direction that can be seen, not direction that must be trusted. It prefers clarity that is visible, not purpose that is still unfolding. And when those preferences are challenged, discomfort arises. But discomfort is not always a sign that something is wrong. Sometimes it is a sign that something is still developing. In this stage, faith becomes less about feeling and more about endurance. It becomes less about immediate understanding and more about continued trust, even without understanding. And this is where the real depth of belief is revealed, not in certainty, but in persistence during uncertainty. Because the most difficult moments are not the ones where everything is lost, but the ones where nothing is clear. And yet, even in that uncertainty, one truth remains quietly present beneath everything else. Just because nothing is visible yet does not mean nothing is being worked on. And holding on to that truth becomes the beginning of everything changing. One of the deepest struggles in life is not always visible on the outside. It happens within the mind. It is the constant desire to control outcomes, to predict what comes next, to make sense of every delay, and to ensure that nothing falls outside of personal understanding. This need for control often feels like protection, like stability, like safety. But over time, it begins to feel more like pressure, because control demands certainty in a world that does not always offer it immediately. When life starts moving in unexpected directions, the natural response is resistance. The natural response is resistance. The mind begins to tighten its grip on plans, expectations, and timelines. It tries to force clarity where none is available yet. It replays situations, analyzes details, and searches for reasons behind every delay. And in doing so, it slowly becomes exhausted. Not because effort is wrong, but because effort is being used to control what is not meant to be controlled. This is where frustration begins to grow quietly. Not always as anger, but as internal tension. A feeling that things should be different, that outcomes should be faster, that answers should already be visible. And when those expectations are not met, disappointment begins to settle in. But the deeper issue is not the situation itself. It is the resistance to uncertainty. Letting go of control feels unnatural at first because it creates a sense of vulnerability. The mind equates control with safety, so releasing control feels like stepping into uncertainty without protection. It feels like losing direction even when direction has not actually disappeared. In reality, what is being released is not stability. It is the illusion of needing to manage everything at once, and that illusion is heavy. It creates mental exhaustion because it demands constant thinking, constant analyzing, constant emotional adjustment. Every situation becomes something that must be solved immediately. Every delay becomes something that must be understood instantly. And every unanswered question becomes a burden that sits in the background of thought. But life was never designed to be carried in full understanding at every moment. There are parts of the journey that only become clear after they are completed. There are paths that only make sense in hindsight. And there are delays that only reveal their purpose after time has passed. Yet in the present moment, the mind struggles to accept what it cannot yet explain. This is where trust is challenged deeply. This is where trust is challenged deeply, because trust requires stepping beyond immediate understanding. It requires accepting that not everything will be clear while it is still unfolding. It requires the willingness to continue moving forward even when full clarity is absent. And that is not easy, especially when emotions are involved, especially when expectations were strong, especially when effort has already been invested and results are not yet visible. In those moments, letting go feels like giving up, even when it is actually making space for something better to unfold. The struggle, then, is not about losing control. It is about redefining what control truly means. Control is not the ability to force outcomes into existence. Control is the ability to remain steady even when outcomes are uncertain. It is the ability to choose trust over panic, patience over frustration, and clarity over confusion. But this shift does not happen instantly. It happens gradually, through repeated moments of surrender, through learning that not everything needs to be solved immediately, through realizing that peace is not found in controlling everything, but in releasing what was never meant to be controlled in the first place. And as this understanding grows, something begins to soften within. The tension reduces slightly. The urgency decreases. The constant need to figure everything out begins to weaken. And in its place, a quieter strength begins to form, a strength that is not dependent on knowing everything, but on trusting even when everything is not known. This is the beginning of real stability, not the stability that comes from control, but the stability that comes from surrender. Because once control is loosened, space is created. space for clarity to arrive at the right time, space for direction to become visible when it is ready, space for peace to exist even in the middle of uncertainty. And in that space, trust begins to grow stronger than fear. There is a unique kind of struggle that does not come from loss, but from waiting. Waiting without clear explanation. Waiting without visible progress. Waiting in a space where everything feels paused, even though life is still moving forward. It is in this waiting that the idea of timing becomes the hardest to accept. Because from a human perspective, timing is expected to align with desire. When something is needed, there is an internal expectation that it should arrive quickly. When effort is applied, there is an assumption that results should follow immediately. But when that does not happen, confusion begins to grow. Not because nothing is happening, but because what is happening cannot yet be seen. This is where delay feels heavy. Days begin to feel longer. Silence feels more noticeable. Progress feels invisible. And the mind starts to interpret delay as absence, as if nothing is moving, as if nothing is unfolding, as if everything has stopped. But what feels like stillness is often movement that is not yet visible. Because not everything that is happening can be immediately perceived. There are processes that require time to develop. There are foundations that must be strengthened before outcomes can be revealed. And there are alignments that must take place quietly before anything becomes visible on the surface. Yet in the middle of waiting, these unseen processes are difficult to recognize. And that is where trust is tested most deeply. Not in moments of clarity, but in moments of delay. Because delay challenges expectation. It challenges patience. It challenges understanding. It creates space where doubt can grow if it is allowed to, and where faith can weaken if it is not anchored. And in that space, the mind often tries to fill in the gaps with assumptions, assuming that nothing is happening, assuming that progress has stopped, assuming that silence means denial. But silence is not always empty. Sometimes silence is preparation. What feels like unanswered waiting may actually be alignment that is still forming. What feels like stagnation may actually be development that is not yet complete. And what feels like delay may actually be protection from receiving something before the right time. Timing is not just about arrival. It is about readiness. And readiness is not always visible from the outside. It is often shaped internally through experiences that build strength, patience, and perspective. Through moments that refine character, deepen understanding, and prepare for what is to come. But because these changes are internal, they are often unnoticed until much later. This is why delay feels confusing, because it does not always come with explanation. Because it does not always come with explanation. It does not always provide visible progress. It requires trust without immediate confirmation. And that is difficult for a mind that is used to understanding things through evidence rather than belief. Yet even in this difficulty, something important is happening. Patience is being formed. Not forced patience, but strengthened patience. The kind that learns to remain steady even when answers are not visible. The kind that learns to stay grounded even when timing is unclear. The kind that learns to trust that what is not yet seen is not necessarily not happening. This is where perspective begins to shift. Instead of seeing delay as a blockage, it begins to be seen as part of a larger process. Instead of interpreting silence as absence, it begins to be understood as preparation. Instead of assuming nothing is moving, there is recognition that movement may simply be hidden from view. And this shift changes everything internally. Anxiety begins to lessen slightly. Pressure begins to reduce. The need to force outcomes begins to weaken. And in its place, a quieter form of trust begins to grow. A trust that does not depend on immediate evidence, but on continued belief in the process. Because timing is not meant to always be understood while it is happening. It is often meant to be understood after it has unfolded. After it has unfolded. And those who learn to remain steady in delay often discover that what once felt like waiting was actually alignment preparing everything to arrive at the right moment in the right way. Even in moments when nothing appears to be changing, something is still unfolding beneath the surface. Life is not limited or what can be immediately seen. In fact, some of the most important processes happen quietly, without announcement, without visibility, and without immediate confirmation. This hidden dimension is often overlooked simply because it does not present itself in obvious ways. When progress is not visible, the assumption is often that nothing is happening, but that assumption is based on sight, not reality. And what is seen is not always the full picture. There are layers of development that operate beyond awareness. Situations are being shaped in ways that are not yet visible. Circumstances are being arranged in ways that cannot yet be recognized. Internal preparation is taking place in ways that do not show immediate results. And yet, all of it contributes to what will eventually become visible later. This is why the absence of visible change does not mean the absence of movement. It only means that the process is still in progress. What feels like stillness is often structured development. What feels like delay is often necessary preparation. What feels like inactivity is often foundational work being completed in silence. And because these processes are hidden, they are often misunderstood as lack of progress when they are actually essential stages of it. One of the most difficult parts of this phase is the inability to measure it. When something is visible, it becomes easier to track. Progress can be observed, compared, and evaluated. But when development happens internally or behind the scenes, there is nothing concrete to measure in the moment. This creates uncertainty in the mind because it removes familiar indicators of movement. And in that space, patience is tested again. Not because nothing is happening, but because everything is happening without confirmation. This is where trust becomes essential. Not emotional trust that depends on feelings, but trust that remains consistent even without evidence. Because if belief is only based on what can be seen, then unseen progress will always be questioned. But unseen progress is often the most important kind. It is in this hidden space that foundations are strengthened. Weaknesses are addressed. Readiness is developed. Timing is adjusted. And alignment is formed in ways that ensure stability when outcomes finally arrive. Without this hidden work, visible results would often lack depth, structure, or sustainability. This is why what is unseen should not be underestimated. Just because it is not visible does not mean it is not valuable. Just because it is not immediate does not mean it is not effective. And just because it is not recognized does not mean it is not essential. In fact, many of the most meaningful changes in life begin in ways that cannot be detected at first. They start quietly, almost imperceptibly, and only become obvious later when their effects are fully developed. And by the time they are visible, much of the important work has already been completed. This understanding changes the way silence is interpreted. Silence is no longer seen as emptiness. It becomes a space of construction, a period where necessary adjustments are being made, a time where alignment is being refined without interruption. And instead of creating anxiety, it begins to create awareness that something deeper is in motion. There is also a shift in expectation. Instead of expecting immediate results, there is recognition that outcomes are often the final stage of a process that has already been unfolding for some time. Instead of demanding visible proof at every moment, there is acceptance that some progress must remain hidden until it is complete. This reduces pressure significantly because the mind no longer needs constant confirmation that things are moving. It begins to trust the process even when it cannot see every step. It becomes more stable, less reactive, and more patient with what is not yet revealed And over time, this patience transforms into quiet confidence. A confidence that does not depend on external validation, but on internal understanding that development is still taking place. A confidence that remains steady even when nothing appears to be changing. A confidence that recognizes that unseen work often produces the strongest foundations. Because what is being built in silence is often what supports everything that will eventually be seen. There is a moment in every journey of trust where everything feels stretched beyond comfort. It is not the beginning and it is not the end. It is the middle point where endurance feels tested in ways that were not expected. This is the breaking point of faith, where silence feels heavier, delay feels longer, and clarity feels further away than ever before. In this space, emotions become more intense, questions become more frequent. Patience begins to feel thin, and the mind, already tired from waiting and wondering, begins to search for relief in any direction that feels immediate. It is here that the weight of uncertainty presses the hardest, because this is no longer about simple waiting. It becomes about holding on when holding on no longer feels easy. At this stage, the contrast between expectation and reality becomes sharper. What was believed to happen quickly has not yet arrived. What was expected to be clear is still unclear. And what was hoped for with confidence now feels surrounded by silence. This tension creates internal pressure that is difficult to ignore. And in that pressure, a quiet question begins to form. Is it still worth trusting? This question does not always come from disbelief. It often comes from exhaustion, from repeated waiting, from ecstasy and dead silence, from the feeling that nothing is changing, even after continued patience. And when this question grows, faith feels as though it is being pulled in two directions at once. But this is exactly where something important is revealed, because breaking points are not only about weakness, they are also about exposure. They reveal what is truly holding everything together. They show whether trust is dependent on circumstances or anchored beyond them. They uncover whether belief is conditional or deeply rooted. In moments of ease, trust feels simple, but in moments of pressure, trust becomes real. This is why the breaking point is not the end of faith. It is its deepest test. It is where emotional reliance is stripped away and only genuine trust remains. It is where surface-level confidence is challenged and deeper conviction is revealed. It is where the mind must choose whether to release trust or hold on to it even without visible confirmation. And that choice defines everything. Because if trust only exists when outcomes are visible, then it is fragile. But if trust remains even when outcomes are hidden, then it becomes strong. The breaking point exposes this difference clearly. It is also in this stage that internal conflict becomes strongest. One part of the mind pushes toward doubt, urging immediate answers, immediate clarity, immediate relief. Another part holds on quietly, reminding that not everything is meant to be understood in the middle of the process. These two forces create tension that feels almost unmanageable at times. But even in this tension, something deeper is being formed. Resilience. Not the kind that is loud or visible, but the kind that develops quietly through persistence in uncertainty, the kind that learns to remain steady even when emotions fluctuate, the kind that continues forward even when understanding is incomplete. This resilience does not appear instantly. It is built through endurance, through moments of choosing to remain grounded even when it feels easier to let go, through decisions made in silence when no immediate reassurance is present, through continued trust when nothing seems to confirm it. And over time, this stage becomes a turning point, because what once felt like breaking begins to transform into strengthening. What once felt like pressure begins to form depth. What once felt like exhaustion begins to build endurance that was not previously there. This is why the breaking point is not destruction. It is refinement. It removes shallow confidence and replaces it with deeper stability. It removes emotional dependence and replaces it with steady trust. It removes temporary belief and replaces it with something far more lasting. And although it feels difficult in the moment, it often becomes one of the most defining stages in the entire journey. Because what survives the breaking point is not weak faith. It is strengthened faith, shaped through pressure and made more resilient than before. There comes a stage where trust no longer feels like waiting, but like transformation already in motion. It is a shift in perception where the focus moves away from what is missing and begins to recognize what is being shaped internally. In this space, trust is no longer passive. It becomes active alignment with what is still unfolding. This is where something powerful begins to happen within the inner world. The energy of uncertainty slowly begins to change into stability. The constant pressure to understand every detail begins to fade, and the need for immediate answers starts to lose its grip. In its place, a deeper awareness begins to rise, a quiet recognition that outcomes are not only approaching, but already being prepared in ways that cannot yet be fully seen. At this level, trust is no longer just about endurance. It becomes about perspective, because the way a situation is interpreted determines the emotional weight it carries. When everything is seen through limitation, delay feels like loss. But when everything is seen through transformation, delay becomes development. The external circumstances may remain unchanged for a time, but the internal understanding begins to shift significantly, and that shift changes everything. Instead of feeling stuck in waiting, there is a growing sense of participation in a process. Instead of feeling disconnected from progress, there is awareness of unseen movement. Instead of interpreting silence as absence, it begins to be understood as preparation. This reframing does not change the timeline, but it completely changes the experience of the timeline. This is the beginning of maturity in trust, a level where emotions are no longer dictated by immediate results, a level where peace is not dependent on visible proof, a level where understanding is no longer required for stability to exist. This maturity does not come quickly. It is shaped through repetition, reflection, and endurance. And once it begins to form, it changes how outcomes are received. Because when trust has been refined through uncertainty, the arrival of results is no longer overwhelming, it is grounding. What once felt distant suddenly becomes understandable in hindsight. What once felt delayed is now recognized as necessary timing. What once felt confusing begins to reveal structure. This is the transformation of perception. But more importantly, it is the transformation of the inner self. Because the greatest shift is not in the situation, it is in the person experiencing it. The situation may eventually resolve, but the internal growth remains permanent. The patience developed here does not disappear once the outcome arrives. The resilience built here does not vanish when the waiting ends. The clarity gained here continues to shape how future challenges are approached. This is why trust has power beyond the moment. It does not only carry through uncertainty, it reshapes the identity of the one who endures it. It reassigns emotional response. It strengthens inner stability. It develops a deeper sense of grounded awareness that remains even when circumstances change. And in this transformation, something becomes clear. Nothing experienced during the process is wasted. Not the waiting, not the silence, not the tension, and not even the doubt. Every part contributes to shaping a stronger internal foundation. Every moment adds depth to understanding. Every phase builds capacity for greater stability in the future. This is how trust becomes transformative. It turns waiting into preparation. It turns uncertainty into refinement. It turns unseen into refinement. It turns pressure into strength. And it turns unseen progress into undeniable growth over time. And as this transformation settles in, the final realization begins to form quietly. The outcome was never just about what was coming, it was also about who was being shaped along the way. At this point, everything comes into focus with quiet clarity. The journey through waiting pressure, silence, and transformation has not been without weight, but it has not been without purpose either. And now the only thing left is a decision that must be made with full awareness, whether to continue standing firm or to let go right before the outcome begins to unfold. This is the moment where everything that has been built internally is tested in action, not in theory, not in emotion, but in steady commitment. Because trust is not proven at the beginning of a journey, it is proven at the end of it, when nothing is left to rely on except inner conviction, when there are no signs to depend on, when external confirmation is still delayed, but the inner foundation has already been formed. This is where real strength becomes visible, not through reaction, but through persistence. Standing firm does not mean ignoring difficulty. It does not mean pretending uncertainty does not exist. It means choosing not to be defined by what is temporarily unclear. It means refusing to let delay rewrite belief. It means continuing forward even when understanding is incomplete. This is the final stage of maturity in trust, a place where emotional fluctuation no longer dictates direction, a place where external silence no longer controls internal stability, a place where conviction remains steady even when circumstances remain unchanged. And in this place, something powerful becomes evident. What has been built internally is stronger than what has been delayed externally, because external situations shift over time, but internal stability determines how those shifts are experienced. When trust is firm, delay loses its power to discourage. When perspective is steady, uncertainty loses its ability to destabilize. When inner conviction is rooted, waiting no longer feels like defeat. It feels like positioning. This is the shift that changes everything. So the call is not to rush the process. It is not to force clarity. It is not to abandon what has been built through pressure. The call is to remain steady even now, to hold on with quiet strength, to continue trusting without needing immediate proof, and to stand firm until what has been prepared becomes visible. Because the final outcome often arrives in the very place where most people give up, and those who remain are the ones who see what endurance produces. So continue to trust even when silence remains. Continue to stand even when timing feels unclear. Continue to hold your ground even when nothing seems to change. Because what has been forming in hidden places is not absent. It is simply not finished yet. And when it is complete, it will not arrive empty. It will arrive with clarity, with purpose, and with confirmation that nothing was ever wasted. So stay steady, stay grounded, stay trusting, and do not stop now. Because the moment you feel like letting go may be the exact moment right before everything begins to align. When trust becomes a consistent practice, something extraordinary begins to happen. The journey through uncertainty, silence, and hidden work does not just lead to temporary results. It reshapes the very framework of life. Those who remain steadfast discover that sticking with God and trusting His plan is not only about the outcome, but about transformation that lasts far beyond the circumstances. The reward begins internally. Patience that once felt impossible becomes natural. Strength that once required constant effort becomes stable. Peace that once seemed fleeting becomes enduring. These are not surface-level changes. They are foundational shifts in perspective, mindset, and character. What is formed internally can never be taken away, regardless of future challenges. Externally, alignment begins to appear. Opportunities that were previously blocked or delayed now become accessible. Situations that once felt impossible begin to resolve with clarity. Connections that were previously hidden emerge at the right time. And when these external confirmations arrive, they no longer feel random. They feel inevitable, as if the entire journey of waiting and trust had been leading to them all along. But the most profound reward is not just in outcomes, it is in identity. The person who learns to trust through delay, difficulty, and hidden work becomes someone who carries confidence, not dependent on circumstances. They develop resilience that cannot be shaken by unexpected challenges. They gain wisdom that comes from observing how patience and alignment eventually bring what was promised. And they hold an inner assurance that every future season will be met with strength and perspective. This lasting reward is amplified by the consistency of trust. Every moment of faith exercised, every time surrender is chosen over anxiety, every instance of patience is a building block that strengthens not only the journey, but the person walking it. Over time, the accumulation of these moments creates a foundation that supports far greater purpose than initially imagined. Ultimately, sticking with God is not passive. It is active. It is not merely waiting for a result. It is aligning, growing, and positioning oneself for what is coming. It is choosing to remain steady, confident, and faithful, even when everything visible suggests otherwise. And it is this steadfastness that transforms both the journey and the destination into something lasting and meaningful. The call now is to carry this lesson forward into every area of life. Do not allow frustration, confusion, or delay to shake the trust that has been built. Do not abandon patience because answers are not immediate. Do not question the process because outcomes are not yet visible. Instead, recognize that every challenge, every silent moment, and every unseen alignment is part of a greater plan, one that rewards endurance, faithfulness, and alignment with divine timing. Call to action. Commit to remaining steadfast in trust. Let patience shape your character. Let faith guide your perspective. And continue to stick with God, knowing that the rewards of alignment, peace, and fulfillment are far greater than anything immediate success could offer. The journey may be challenging, but those who remain steadfast will experience not just outcomes, but transformation that lasts a lifetime.